All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and we've been going through the textbook Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015 6th edition. And we are in the last chapter of part 1 of the book. Remember, again, that part 1 of the text was called The Essence of ASP.NET Programming. And what it said at the beginning was, this section presents the essential skills for designing, coding, and testing ASP.NET web applications. So we've already gone through Chapter 1, which introduced us to the concepts and terms related to ASP.NET programming. Then we went into Chapter 2, where we developed the one-page web application, or a one-page web application using ASP.NET. And this was that built-in, or not built-in, but the one that the author did on future value. All right. Then in Chapter 3, we looked at how to kind of merge together HTML5, CSS3, and Bootstrap with an ASP.NET application. Then in Chapter 4, we looked at how to develop a two-page shopping cart application that provided us with product data from a database. In this chapter, Chapter 5, we learn how to test and debug ASP.NET applications. So the idea is, after we complete these first 5 chapters, we'll be able to develop real-world applications on our own, albeit fairly simple applications. We should now, by the end of this chapter, have a solid understanding of how ASP.NET works. And then, once we finish this chapter, we will go into, and it should make sense, Chapter 6. And Chapter 6 in this book begins our journey into Section 2 of the book, which is on ASP.NET Essentials, which expands upon what we learned in Section 1. So let's jump into this, how to test and debug ASP.NET applications. Here's our objectives. Test a web application, including a browser link, to test in more than one browser and using the browser's development or developer tools. Number 2, use the debugging techniques presented in the chapter to determine the cause of runtime or logic errors in any of the ASP.NET applications being developed. Then in our knowledge objectives, number 1, describe how you can test applications for concurrency errors. All right. Number 2, describe the conditions under which the exception assistant dialog box will be displayed. Number 3, distinguish between breakpoints and trace points. Number 4, describe the 3 step commands that you use to control the execution of an application when it reaches a breakpoint, those being step into, step over, and step out. Number 5, describe the use of the diagnostic tools window for monitoring the performance of an application. Number 6, describe the use of the local window and the watch window. Finally, number 7, describe the use of the trace feature inside of ASP.NET. All right. Now, as they mention here, this is the browser menu of a standard toolbar. Well, let's do this. Now, I'm not going to lie to you here. I did the first 4 chapters, the first 4 PowerPoint lectures a while back, and now I'm jumping back into this after creating other videos. So, let's start up our Visual Studio. And we'll come in and do a file, new, website. And it says what kind do we want. Let's just use the predetermined one. So rather than an empty one, let's use the ASP.NET web form site. We will put it in our desktop right under the desktop, and I'm just going to call this ASP.NET Test. Okay? Nothing dramatic about that. And remember how this is going to come in and it's going to build our site for us. It'll provide a bunch of folders and a bunch of stuff already done for us. Again, this particular example is going to be used more just to demonstrate some of the different features and functionality, especially when it comes to testing ASP.NET website applications. So, if you notice again, there's a bunch of stuff that's already been built for us. An exception has occurred. Well, that's not a good thing. Not sure why that would have happened. But we should have, there should be a default here. Hopefully this is going to come up on the screen. Close this. Let's see if we try to run this, if we get an error, if it works. All right, looks good. Okay, and that's our typical ASP.NET page. There's the Jumbotron here. It's set up with a Bootstrap interface. Okay, these don't go anywhere, but you can see they're regular buttons. In fact, I guess a couple of them may go someplace. All right. Yeah. All right. We've got the home page. We've got a very simple about page and a very simple contact page. None of which have all that much on them. Okay. So that's what we have thus far. So why am I even showing you that? Let's stop the run here. It says here the browser menu in the standard toolbar. All right. When we go to run our program, we've got our choice over, basically, for lack of better words, what browser we want to use. All right. If I right mouse click on here, we can say View in Browser, and notice it's browsing with Edge by default, but I can say Browse With, and I can choose to use any of the different browsers that I have loaded on my machine. Not sure what internal web browser does. I think that just runs it in whatever is built into the software. But I tend to use Google Chrome for the majority of my web development. So I'm going to click on there, and I'm going to choose Add. In fact, I shouldn't even have to do that. Click on there and click Browse. All right. So what's the difference? The difference is I brought this up under Google Chrome. All right. The reason for showing you that is I can bring it, again, bring my application up and run it under any browser that I have, loaded onto my machine. Okay. So, how to run an application in the default browser without debugging, with debugging. So the author mentions here the easiest way to do it, and they mention is to press F5 or do a debug start. Well, there's actually other ways to do it than that. So if I want to run this, okay, if I want to run my default program, I can either hit F5. I just hit the F5 key, so there it is. You can see now I've actually got it running twice. Okay, or I can click Debug, Start Debugging, and run it like that. Okay, or, and to me this is the easiest way, is I can just press the green arrow there. And again, notice it says Microsoft Edge. If I click the down arrow here, I can choose to run it. Now my default browser has changed to Chrome. And if I click that, boom, there it is up and running in Chrome. All right. Now, if I want to run it without debugging, and I would never suggest that you do that, instead of hitting F5, you can do a Control F5. All right. Or, so you can do a Control F5, or you can click Debug and do a Start Without Debugging. Okay. Or you can right mouse click and choose an Open With. I believe that'll do it too. Or is it View in Browser? Nope, it's View in Browser. Now, so what's the difference between running it with debugging and running it without debugging? It's a natural question. If you click here and you run it with debugging, if there are errors, so if I were to have errors in my code, let's see if I can, why nothing is showing here. For some reason, this isn't running right now. It's not coming up and showing on my screen. That's not really important though, but what I want to mention to you is if you run this without debugging and you have error messages, what it'll do is to try to run the program and it'll find that there's error messages. So it should come back then and say, hey, you know, you've got errors. Do you want to run the last version that worked? And I believe if you run it without debugging, it'll naturally do that. And if you run it with debugging, it'll actually stop and say, hey, you know, what do you want to do here? Let's come in and try this. Right mouse click, add new item. All right, I'm going to add a new web form. And I'm going to call this debugme.aspx. Okay? And that should create somewhere in here. There it is. So it created a new, okay. Again, I've never seen this before where it's not showing anything in here. I don't know why. Okay. If I were to put an error in there and then run that particular file, I would get some kind of an error message. But if I tell it to run it without debugging, it'll try to run it anyway. It'll get to a certain point and then it'll just stop. All right. My guess is the reason I'm getting these error messages here is there's been some kind of a new version that's come out or a new release of the software that I don't have. So I'm going to have to go and look into that. All right. The card app in Chrome and in IE at the same time. The only difference will be between running it one browser as opposed to the other is anything that you have not defined in your program, fonts or whatever, anything that you have not defined, the system will use the defaults for the browser. And the defaults for Chrome may be different than the defaults for IE, which may be different than the defaults for Firefox, etc. All right, but you can run them in any browser you want to run them in. All right. How to view all linked browsers? Guess what? I just showed you that. I showed you that down arrow right there, and you saw the different browsers that we had. 2 ways to refresh all linked browsers. We could try that, but I don't think, again, that was the problem that we were having here. So I told it to refresh all the linked browsers, but that still isn't buying me anything. Like I said, nothing is showing here, and I've never seen this before. So I'll have to go back and see if there's a fix for that. All right. IE with DOM Explorer of the developer tools. Well, the bottom line is this. When you go and run your website, okay, you can go and hit your F12 key and bring up the DOM Explorer. Now, this is the IE DOM Explorer. Let's see if we can do this. I have no idea if what I'm about to show you is going to work or not. so this is book applications. We don't have any for Chapter 5, but there's Chapter 4. So I'm going to try to bring this up. All right, so you bear with me for a moment, please. I'm going to do a file, and I'm going to close this solution, and I'm going to do a file, open website, and where do I want to go here? Well, I want to go there. So I told it to open up my Chapter 4 that I was working on. All right? All right. So let's run this and see what happens. There were errors. That is never a good sign. Could not load Chapter 4 cart.order or cart.cart. Wow. Well, we've got a Chapter 3 future value bootstrap here. Let's try that. Now, if this comes up and this also runs as an error right away, yeah, there is some kind of a problem. All right, so there is an error in my software. That appears to be what the problem is. So let me just go on and talk about this. If you're bringing up a website and you hit the F12 key, you can bring up the developer tools for that particular browser that you're using, i.e. it's developer tools. It might have a different name. I know Chrome's, I think, is called developer tools also. Firefox has got their own developer tools, etc. But you can bring them up and you can see the CSS that you're using. You can actually run the console. You can run the debugger from here. So there's different things that you're able to do with this. And you'll notice that with all of them, the easiest way to open the developer tools is to press your F12 function key. You press it to open and it's a toggle. You can press it again to close. Or if you've got a web page up and running, you can right mouse click on an element of the web page and choose Inspect Element. Now that's how you do it in Chrome, Firefox, and IE. If you happen to be running this in Opera or in Safari, that's how you do it. I'm not going to run through those because virtually 100% of the development we'll do in this class will be one of these three. Again, I'll do the majority of mine probably in Chrome. This is also the same way that you do it in Edge. And Edge is just basically the newest version of IE. All right. How to view the rendered HTML and CSS styles. Open the appropriate panel by clicking on its tab. In IE, it's the DOM Explorer. In Firefox, it's the Inspector. In Chrome or Safari or Opera, it's called Elements. We will take a look at that, and we will run that basically as a class. All right, let's talk for a minute about the exception assistant. And what the exception assistant is, is what comes up when you've got an error in your code. An error in code in most programming languages is known as a programming exception. Now, an exception in a programming language is not like an exception in real life. If you say someone is exceptional, that usually is a compliment. But when you talk about an exception in programming language, it's an exception to the norm. It's something that you don't want to have happen. All right? In this particular example that they're showing here, they're saying that you have a format exception. So what they're saying here is if the item is null, meaning there's nothing in it, well, they're trying to convert it, and you can't convert what's not there. So you get an error message, again, also known as an exception. The exceptions come up in what's called the exception assistant dialog box. That's what you see on your screen right here. All right. They show it in green. Sometimes it comes up in more of a yellow tinge. That's not what's important. The important thing is the system is trying to show you what the error or what the exception was and give you some kind of detail as to what caused it. All right, so they're saying there was a format exception that was not handled in the user code. They give you some tips for trying to solve it. Now, sometimes the reason that you got the exception is you've got an error in your logic, and that typically won't be printed out or pointed out in the exception assistant, because all the exception assistant can do is to check your code, and it can check it for syntax, and it can check it to see if you violated the rules of the language. But it has no idea if you're getting wrong answer because you're subtracting when you mean to be adding or something like that. That's a logic error. And the exception assistant cannot find logic errors. Only you can find logic errors. Now, when you run through this stuff, and I don't know if it'll even, I guess it won't let me bring up any code, so I can't show it to you. But if you click in the gray area that's on the left of where you've got your line numbers, this is called the gutter area. All right? And when you click in a line there, and I believe you cannot click in a blank line or you cannot click in a comment that's in green here, but if you click in one of the executable lines of code, what'll happen is over here you'll get a red dot. That red dot is called a breakpoint. And what happens is that literally the system will break or stop when it gets to that point. And when it does, you can go in and take a look at, what's going on, etc. You can get a listing of your breakpoints, and you click it to turn it on. You click the same breakpoint that you just had on to turn them off. If you right mouse click in here and you've got several breakpoints, because you can have as many as you want or need to have. So I could have one here, I could have another one here, I could have another one here, etc. If I want to clear all of them out at once, I should be able to right mouse click in this gutter area, and there is an option that comes in there that says either clear all breakpoints or disable all breakpoints. Not only are there breakpoints, but there are things called trace points. All right? With a breakpoint, as it says right there, or as it shows you right there, the breakpoint is a round circle. Okay? On the other hand, when you use a trace point, it's going to be a diamond. So you can set a breakpoint before you run an application, or as the application is executing. Typically, you'll set it up, and you'll set up your breakpoints before you run the program. Again, as mentioned, sometimes you need to set more than one breakpoint. And this right here is called your breakpoints window. So again, to set the breakpoint, you click in this gutter area. It's also referred to as the margin indicator bar. To remove it, you click it again. To remove all of them, you should either be able to right mouse click on here, or you can click up here, you can click debug, and then there's a delete all breakpoint commands. You can also disable breakpoints, which keeps them in there, but basically tells the system to just skip them, for lack of better words. If you want to display this breakpoints window that you see down here, it's debug, and underneath debug is a Windows command, and then under the Windows there's a breakpoint. So when ASP.NET, when it encounters a breakpoint, if I'm running the program right now and my program looks like what's shown in here, then what I've done is I've gone into break mode, and it goes into break mode before it executes the statement on which the breakpoint is set. You can only set a breakpoint on a line that contains an executable statement, typically one that ends with a semicolon. All right. As mentioned, not only are there breakpoints, there are trace points. A trace point is a special kind of breakpoint that is designed to perform an action when it's encountered. To set a trace point, you use the breakpoint settings window, which was right here, and you use that to indicate what you want to do when the trace point is hit. Most often, you'll log some kind of a message to the output window and continue execution. The message that you log might be anything. In other words, it could be the value of a variable, it could be an expression, and typically this is useful in situations where a standard breakpoint would be, for lack of better words, cumbersome. So in other words, let's imagine that this is a for loop that's going to run 1,000 times. And if I put a breakpoint there like this, that breakpoint is going to be hit 1,000 times. That's not what I want. Even though you can loop through quickly, it's doing that 1,000 times. But if I set a trace point, all right, then basically it'll give you a report of the loop's execution with just one click when you click the Start Debugging button. So again, a trace point is a special type of breakpoint that lets you perform some kind of an action when it's encountered. You'll typically use trace points to print messages to the output window. To set a trace point, you right mouse click on the statement and you choose Breakpoint Insert Trace Point. If program execution continues after the trace point is performed, then it becomes the diamond. Otherwise, it's going to look like any other breakpoint. All right? So again, it's like anything else in here. It's a matter of just getting used to it. Is this hard to do? No, it's not. All right? Does it take some getting used to? Of course it does. All right, so here's output that you could get from a trace point window. All right, so this shopping cart application that is run throughout the textbook is shown here in breakpoint or break mode. I shouldn't say breakpoint mode, it's called break mode. So here is where I've got a breakpoint. It's on the if statement. That is an executable statement. And if I take my mouse then and basically rest it over here, I can get a bunch of information. So I can see at the current point in time when I'm running the program just exactly what values are in my variables. Okay? So when you enter break mode, the debugger highlights the next statement that you're about to execute. Again, you can use the debug windows then and the buttons in the debug menu and the toolbar to control, for lack of better words, kind of what happens next. If you want to display the value of a variable or a property, you position the mouse, and that's what they've done here. And it brings up what's called a data tip. Now, what you can also do in here is you can run these commands. This is the same thing that's shown on page 189 of your textbook. So, if you want to start running your application, you can click F5, and I already showed you that. If you had stopped the application for a breakpoint or whatever, all right, you can hit F5 again to start it back up and running. If you want to force the system to enter break mode, you can do a Control-Alt-Break. If you've got the program is debugging and you're just like, okay, I figured out what my error is, I want to stop debugging, I want to get out of the application so I can just go and fix my errors, you do a Shift F5. If the program is running and it appears to be in a loop or it's stuck or whatever, you can at least try to get it out with a Control plus Shift plus F5, which, as mentioned here, should restart the entire application. Then you've got the 3 step methods. F11 is probably the most interesting because what F11 does is it runs your program one statement at a time. If you hit the F11 key, what you're going to notice as far as what happens when you do this is it'll look like, well, wait a minute, I didn't write that, etc. That's not the point. What F11 does is it goes through your entire program execution, both statements you've written and calls that are automatically made, all right, calls that are automatically made in the program itself. All right, now again, I'd like to show you this, but since I'm getting error messages when I'm trying to run these, I can't. So F11 runs a statement at a time. You can keep hitting F11 to run the next statement, the next statement, the next statement. And if the program is running, it'll stop with each statement. You can take your mouse and put it over, the statement and get a data tip, etc. All right. F10, as it says, execute one statement at a time, except for called methods. So it'll be just like F11, but I believe what step over will do is if you get into a loop or something, it will allow you to step through it quicker. Step out, which is Shift plus F11, if you are in the middle of something. So if you're in a method, and let's say the method is really long and you're like, I just want to get out of this method, you can do a Shift F11 to get out of there. Now, kind of mentioned this earlier, but I want to say this to you again. This locals window and the watch window that you see here, and these are taken right from page 191 in your textbook. These are unbelievably strong features. The locals window displays information about variables that are within scope. So they're whatever method is currently running, it shows you all of the variables and what their values are. The watch window lets you view the values of variables and expressions that you specify. So you can put your own stuff in here so that while the program is running, things might come into scope or go out of scope. If you want to add a watch expression, you just basically into this name column, you would type a new name into here. If you don't want one of these that are in here anymore, so if I didn't want this, I would right mouse click on it and choose delete watch. All right. There's also something called the immediate window, and this is also shown on page 191. The immediate window is used to display specific values from a program while the program is executing. So the system is showing you what's available here, and you can highlight something, and then it'll show you the current values of those. So if you want to display a value in an immediate window, so if you want to display your own stuff, you can type in question mark followed by what you want to display. And just so you know, what's typically going to happen when you use the immediate window is it's going to display down here. You can use it for a lot of different things. You can display current values. You can actually do some trivial math with it, etc. If you want to remove all the commands that are in your immediate window, you right-click on the window and you choose Clear All. If you want to display any of these windows, all right, sometimes they're going to actually just show and you can click on them to display them. Otherwise, what you will have to do is from here, you will have to click Debug, and from Debug, you'll have to go to Windows, and you'll notice there's the breakpoints, etc. There's the immediate window. So you can go and you can jump to those windows from there as well. All right, sorry this isn't the way I planned on showing this to you, but again, until I fix this problem that I have, All right, this is the way I'm going to have to do it. So I'm going to try to fix this as soon as I'm done with the lecture here. All right, next. As you can see, the diagnostic tools window. You use the diagnostic tools window to find performance issues. All right, so for instance, I might have two breakpoints. One that's maybe on line 300 and one that maybe is on line 500. And what I can do with the diagnostic window is I can check and see how much time has elapsed between when the first breakpoint is hit and when the second breakpoint is hit. So you might say, well, that's fine. Why would I ever want to do anything like that? Well, everything we've talked about thus far has been on how to correct errors. Sometimes, though, the program's running, but it's just running so slow that there's a bottleneck someplace, but you don't know where that bottleneck is, and you'd like to find out where it is so you can alleviate the bottleneck. So the page may load too slowly, or it may freeze when you click a button, or something else like that may happen. So Visual Studio has combined these, the tools that you use to do this into a diagnostic window. By default, the diagnostic window will open automatically when you run the application with debugging. All right? It presents the information in two ways. And as it says here, the upper half of the window displays information in a graph along a timeline. So it's trying to show you the information there. The lower half displays detailed information in tabs down here. So what you can do is you can use, for example, the diagnostic tools window to display information for breakpoint events, memory usage, and CPU usage. So you can start to look in here to try to figure out what your problem might be. All right, you'll also have in here this process memory timeline that shows how much memory an application is using as it executes. The reason that can be important is, again, you might find that you're going out to a site, to another site from your site, or you're loading a very intricate graphic, or you're loading something else that's really taking a lot of time. So again, the idea is your program's working, but it's just not working as well as you think it could be working. So again, you use the diagnostic window to find performance issues with the web application. You use breakpoints, data tips, and debugging, all right, just like you do with server-side C# code. Now in the book they mention this works best in IE, and it does. This is a product made by Microsoft, the ASP.NET running C#, so it would of course work probably the best with a Microsoft browser, be it IE, Edge, whatever. But I've used it quite successfully with Firefox and or with Chrome as well. The last thing that's discussed in this chapter is how to use what are called trace messages and the trace feature. Now this trace feature traces the execution of whatever page is running, and it displays trace information at the bottom of the page. So it's letting you know here, these are built-in ASP.NET events that are running. Okay? And it's showing you those events. Okay, it's showing you those events that normally wouldn't be shown, but when you turn trace on, that's what it shows you. Now, when you turn the trace on, there are different ways that you can do it. You can turn tracing on for the entire website, which means as you go from page to page, etc., you're going to see all of this information. You can turn it on just for the current page, and you can also turn it on just for certain things that are running on a page. So if you want to activate it for a page, you go up to the code for that page, and at the very top, you set the trace attribute to true. Again, I can't show you it right now, but you have to take my word for it. That's what you do. Now, what's powerful about this is not this so much as it is, so again, this is the page directive, so you would add the trace equal true. By default, tracing is not turned on. If I want to turn it on for the entire application, I can go down into my web.config file and set tracing and enable it to true, like this. So this would be just for a page. This would be for the entire application. All right. Now, where this can become quite powerful is that you can create your own custom trace methods with this. Why would you want to do that, or why would you perhaps want to do that? Well, the reason that you would perhaps want to do that is when certain things are happening, you might want to be given, as you trace a program to make sure that what you think is happening is exactly happening. All right? And there's different ways that you can do this. You can use a write or you can use a warning. What's the difference? All right? If you use a write like this, it shows it in black, so it's kind of hard for it. It doesn't stick out really. So we put our own message in here that says when we get to this point, tell us that binding products in a drop-down list. So there it is. On the other hand, when you use a warning, and I guess they're not showing it in here, but the warning comes in red. So if instead of saying trace.write, I had said trace.warn, just replace the write with a warn, this line here that says binding products drop-down list would have appeared in red, which makes it much easier for you to find it while the program's running. Sometimes these program traces can be quite long, and if you're looking for your own custom message and you just use a write, it may be hard to find. If you use a warn, it's going to be much easier to find. Hopefully that just makes sense. So these trace methods, again, are written only if tracing is enabled. Okay? So they're showing some tracing in here for that future value application. And notice what they've done. They're tracing it, and they're saying that what they've set in there for trace is they want to know values at certain points. Okay. So we've now gone through the first 5 chapters in the book, the first 200 pages of the book. In this chapter, we learned how to test a web application, how to change our browser. We learned about several debugging techniques that you could use. All right. When they talk about concurrency errors here, that becomes much more of an issue when you're working, for example, with databases. But when you have concurrency, for lack of better words, a very quick, down and dirty little explanation, is when different people are trying to perform the same operation on the same code at the same time. All right, again, that'll become more apparent when we get into the database section, which is section 3 of the book. We talked about the exception assistant, when that might come up, what exceptions are, etc. We talked about the difference, and you saw the visual difference between breakpoints, which are the round red circle, and trace points, which are the red triangle. And again, trace points, typically you write a message out with it. All right. We also looked at with breakpoints how when you break, you can take your mouse and put it over a line of code, and you can get what are called data tips to find out current values. We looked at the 3 different step commands, or at least talked about them. Okay. So we looked at the step into, where you hit F11 and you go basically, if you remember that one, it was going in there basically a line at a time. Okay. And then we looked at the step over, which does the same thing, except when you get called methods, I think it just shows the call. And you've got step out. So if you're inside of a big loop it provides you with the opportunity to get out quickly. Next, we looked at some of the diagnostic tools in the diagnostic tool window that you can use, again, to monitor application performance. So if your program is running slowly and you want to try to fix it, that would be why you'd use that. Okay? We described what the locals window was and the watch window, and in a quick little nutshell, the locals window is designed to show you the values of local variables. The watch window will show you any variable you want while the program's running. So it's more global, I guess, in nature. And we ended the chapter by talking about the trace feature that's in ASP.NET. So again, we've now gone through the first 5 chapters in this book. It's going to be my responsibility, before we go on in here, and before we begin chapter 6, which is on how to use the standard server controls. So before we do that, I'll have to go in and fix, all right, the errors that I have. So I'm going to come in and try one more thing. I'm going to do a file, and I'm going to tell it to close the solution. Do I want to save the changes? No, it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to do here, in fact, let's do this. Let's exit the whole application, and let's start it up again and see. I wish I would have logged that error that I got when I did this. So kind of funny, I'm actually hoping I get the error that comes up when I start to do this. So when I do a file, new, website, ASP.NET, we'll just use website 1, which is the default name. And if this doesn't work, what I'll have to do is probably reboot the system and see if I can get the same error. Hopefully, by the time you're watching these videos, we'll have this fixed. If I'm getting the error, there's probably at least a chance that you'll get the error as well. Again, I have not run any ASP.NET code probably for about 2 months on here. Now, isn't that funny? Now it showed me the code. And before it did not. So there is my ASPX code. So that's default ASPX. There is the associated C# code. Wow. So now it works. Let's see if we go in here and we run this. And I guess it did start like this before. It's when we tried to bring up existing files that we had the problems. Okay, so I guess that one does work. If you remember, we looked at that before. All right. So let's do a file, close solution. Do I want to stop debugging? Yes. So let's do a file, open website, and let's go back. This was the Chapter 4 shopping cart, so let's bring that up and see if I get an error or don't get an error. So remember, when I tried to run this, I got these errors, could not load. So I'm going to have to try to fix that. I will, and whatever I find out, you'll learn about when we get to the next lecture. See you then.